You're listening to Sparking Conversations on Culturally Responsive Childcare, the podcast where we get real about what culturally responsive practice actually looks like in the day-to-day of early learning. Hi, my name is Sarah Andrews. I'm a public health researcher with a background in child and youth programming.
And I'm Terra Louis. I'm a mom of two boys and an anthropologist. I grew up in Germany and now call Edmonton home.
We're part of the team that was behind the Spark Guide, a guide to culturally responsive early learning and childcare in Alberta, created by PolicyWise for Children and Families, together with early childhood practitioners and experts from across Alberta. We're recording from Treaty 6 territory and the North Saskatchewan River territory of the Métis Nation, a traditional traveling route and gathering place for many Indigenous people. Each episode, we sit down with educators and leaders who share their stories, their light bulb moments, and the small things that make a big difference for belonging and cultural learning. So whether you're brand new to the Spark Guide or looking for fresh inspiration, we're here to spark ideas you can bring into your program tomorrow.
And that wall became more than documentation. It said that these walls have soul. And it was true. Children found belonging there. Families saw themselves honored. The space reflected the stories and the identities and the connections that shaped who we were as a community, who we became as a community. The experience changed me. For this episode, we will talk about the realities of early childhood education and childcare. It's really busy. There's so much to take care of during a day. Help kids with their emotions, their routines, the meals and snacks, the naps, lots of things to wipe down, lots of things to encourage. And now in the winter, there's probably a good amount of time spent helping kids get in and out their winter gear. It's just a lot that needs to happen in a day. How do educators find the time and the capacity to create spaces that are culturally safe and celebrate what they're learning from families in the busyness of their day-to-day?
We're excited to have Jody Merrick here with us today to reflect on these questions. Jody is the manager for early childhood development at the Terra Centre in Edmonton. The Terra Centre provides supports and services that empower teen parents. She lives in Edmonton, though her roots are in Saskatchewan and remain an important part of who she is. And she says it still feels like home. At the Terra Centre for Teen Parents, she supports the Child and Family Support Center. She worked in the profession for more than 25 years across diverse contexts, including day homes, center-based programs, school-based and faith-based preschool settings. An interesting piece of trivia about Jody that she has shared with us is that she used to be a dental assistant, but she only enjoyed work when the children came to the clinic. In her free time, she finds joy in being in nature, swimming laps, sipping chai teas, and reading, though her greatest joy comes from the time spent with her family.
Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. Our team met you just recently because we were lucky enough to go on a tour for different childcare centers, and your program really stood out to us for how you created a culturally responsive space, and in particular for Indigenous moms and families. So we're really thrilled to have you here today and share your perspectives and some stories. Welcome, Jody.
Thank you for having me. It's a real honor to be here and to share.
So to start with, we're going to ask you a really quick question that we're asking each of our guests. What are the 2 or 3 words that come to mind first when you think of culturally responsive childcare?
Yeah, that's challenging. 2 or 3 words to limit it to that. Maybe community, family voice, participation, and if I can add, honoring differences.
Oh, thank you. These are some new ones. I'm really curious about the participation piece. Hopefully, we can dive deeper into that. But first, let's start a little bit talking about your journey. Tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you become passionate about culturally responsive childcare?
Okay, well, thank you for giving me the space to share. I think it's through stories. Hearing stories of families and making that space for listening to stories. I think that it became real for me through a very beautiful experience that I had as an early childhood educator. Years ago, I was working in the toddler room, and my co-educator and we invited families into a simple inquiry to tell us the story of their child's name. And we had no idea how this would unfold. What began as a small project quickly became the heartbeat of our playroom. The documentation wall where we gathered these stories grew into a living landmark, something children visited again and again, a touchstone that anchored them to their families throughout the day. There's a quote in Flight that I return to often, and it simply says that children and families have the right to see themselves reflected in our early childhood community. That idea of social recognition and acceptance. And during that project, I saw this come to life. Families shared the meanings, the histories, the languages, and the love embedded in their children's names, profound stories of their children's names. I, as an older mom, don't think I put the level of thought into some of the names that I was considering when I was naming my child. Just really beautiful stories behind those names. And the wall filled with the documentation and the artifacts and the pieces that we created together with those families, that held that deep meaning for all of us. And then came something that we hadn't anticipated, and that was the tattoos. So many of our families had their child's name tattooed somewhere on their body. And so when we made that discovery and that connection, we knew that we had to include that somehow, because that was a powerful connection that they have with their child that is permanently marked on their bodies, that they carry their child with them in that way. We took photos of their tattoos and we added that as the artifacts on our walls. And when the children began pointing out their parents' tattoos with pride, that's my daddy's neck. That's my flower. Because some of them, it wasn't just their name. There was a birth flower, and their child knew that was her mom, the birth flower on her shoulder. And that's me. And one parent even shared a poem that she had written for her unborn child that she had tattooed on her back. And so that was also part of our wall. And that wall became more than documentation. It said that these walls have soul. And it was true. Children found belonging there. Families saw themselves honored. The space reflected the stories and the identities and the connections that shaped who we were as a community, who we became as a community. The experience changed me. It showed me that culturally responsive care isn't a curriculum add-on. It's a way of being with children and families. It begins with listening. It takes shape through relationships. And it grows when we create space for families to bring their stories, their languages, their symbols, tattoos as a symbol, and their histories into our environment. And this is where my passion grew, through witnessing how powerful it is when children and families truly see themselves in the places where they live and learn and belong.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing. That's a fantastic story. I love how it started with what you thought might be a simple invitation to share something about the name. And it opened the door for so much sharing about culture and history and what's important to the families. And then, as you said, it changed the space that the children and the families felt like they belonged and they were represented and reflected. So you kicked us off really nicely. Tell us a little bit more after this experience. What else did you try in the busyness of the day to day to integrate that? So it's not an add on, but it's part of the thinking and part of the invitations that you put out on a day to day basis to children and their families.
That's a great question and a deep question. And it makes me really reflect on what is important. And what it comes down to is that idea of trying to suspend our assumptions that we have about children and families. Culture comes from children and families. Sometimes it's something that we can see. We can see the evidence, it's very visible, and sometimes it's not. And so diving into authentic relationship and that reciprocity with families so that we can build an authentic community and learn about what's important to them. We become partners with families in the care and learning of their children. They're the experts of their child, they're the experts of their culture. And I'm not. I'm on a learning journey trying to figure out, you know, who I am in relationship to families. And all of the team of educators are doing the same thing. What are our commonalities and what are our differences that need to be celebrated? We've been working with Flight for a long, long time. And so I do often refer to it. One of my most favorite quotes from Flight is, I'm going to read it for you because it's a beautiful quote. Early childhood communities are tapestries of dynamic differences. In honoring our differences, we create opportunities to know others and ourselves in new and deeper ways. And that is so true. That tapestry of dynamic differences and the idea of weaving together and creating this beautiful community together. The idea of relationships, that's what it comes down to. And all the ways of being and knowing, and we co-create and we learn this through those relationships and engaging in a practice of relationships with children and families, sharing stories, sharing ideas, inviting the families and their voice into the decision making, and doing that in a way that is truly collaborative.
Yeah, this is a really great way of thinking about it because it's not that educators have to know all these things or have to have now this long list of potential activities that they could do to make their space more culturally responsive. It's the relationship building. It's being authentic and curious and diving into the relationships and learning from the families. So it's a really nice shift in thinking about it. It's not a to-do list. It's a mindset or an attitude to be in the relationships.
Absolutely. I think one of the most powerful ways that we make that learning alongside families visible throughout our spaces, and it's one of the things that would have been noticeable on the tour that you were recently on, is our documentation. The learning stories, the living wall. We use the living walls as a reflective tool, as a way to make the experience of children visible in the playroom, and it becomes that anchor. That earlier story I told about when I was first in the toddler room, that was a living wall of sorts. Our walls continue to hold the stories of children and families. That's really important to us. It's materials, and it's more than materials. We can have dolls and we can have clothing and food items and other objects that offer a sense of familiarity and hold meaning for children and families. But how do we truly know unless we extend invitations for them to share the stories and suspend our assumptions about, oh, if I put this in our kitchen area, this will show the culture of the families or be a representation of the culture of the families who are in our spaces. We do that. We do bring in things that are reflective, but also the stories are where it's rich and powerful.
And you mentioned learning stories. So I'm curious if you can talk a little bit more about that and maybe even give us a really concrete example so we have a good idea of what this looks like and who engages with that learning story. Like, do you communicate with the families, with other staff? Do you learn as an organization from those? Just tell us a little bit more about that.
Awesome. I would love to. Learning stories are my passion. Anytime that we can tell a strength-based story about a child's experience is a great thing, in my opinion. Learning stories, they're a form of pedagogical documentation that do make the learning of children visible. We use Flight and the language of Flight to help make meaning of what children's experiences. And it's through photo documentation so that they're full of photos. The educators will write an observation in story form and then include some meaning making about what that particular story might mean, and then some follow-up examples. And so a concrete example of that, there's many, many stories, but one that really stands out for me is a story of a young boy. He was newer to our center. It was his first time in childcare. And so he was going through that adjustment period where, he's building relationships with the educators. The educators are getting to know him as well. They've been chatting with the family, and learning a little bit about the family. So this one particular day, he had woken up from a nap earlier than the other children. And one of the educators was sitting with him. And we have some drums that we have made in the playroom. We had an Indigenous elder come alongside us and help us make drums. So she had brought this drum off of the shelf and offered this opportunity to this young boy with the drumstick. She also had a drum and a drumstick. And so she was demonstrating, she was beating, tapping on the drum. And he was looking at her and looking at her, and he seemed reluctant. And then finally he gestured at her in a way that was like, stop. And then he held his hand up in the air with his drumstick in his hand, and he gestured to her in a way that's without words, in a way that communicated, this is how you do it. Watch me. I'm going to show you. And then he started to tap on the drum very gently. Sorry, gets me emotional. So he was teaching her in that moment about how to tap on the drum, So then she started to follow his lead, and she started to tap on the drum the way that he was showing her how to do that. So then when she shared that story with the family later that day, when they came to pick him up, the family said that his kukum has been speaking or singing to him in Cree since he was born and drumming with him. And so he knew, he had a fund of knowledge that the educator in that playroom did not have. And he showed her, he taught her, this young, less than 2-year-old, taught her how to drum properly because she was not doing it right. And so she made that into a learning story, and she gifted that to the family. She told the whole story about how he woke up from the nap. She brought out the drum, and then he started to show her how to drum properly. And what that meant about how his culture is important and his way of being is important. And so they want to honor that. And then in sharing that with the family and having the family voice in there as well, she wrote a little bit about how she followed up with the family, and the family let her know about the Cookham singing to him increase since he was born and his experience with from birth within his family culture. That's an example of a learning story. It's co-created with the child and the family and the educator.
Wow, that is so powerful to hear. And it's such a great way to learn from the family in a natural way. It's a concrete situation with their child, and then they can help the educators make sense of it with whatever they're willing and comfortable to share. Thank you so much for sharing this. And I'm wondering, do you share these stories with your whole team?
We do, not as often as we should, but within the playroom teams, they do share within each other because they'll talk and have that reflective practice together about, I was noticing this of the child. And that educator might have a piece of information to share with that educator that might inform the story and create a rich and deeper perspective, because perhaps they already had a conversation with the family about what the meaning of that play is, or what the meaning of that experience, or whatever the child might be showing us in their play. I was in the playroom one time, the toddler playroom, and there was a child in there. I was just sitting in the kitchen area, and she started to bake cookies for me. She was engaged in an imaginative scenario, and she started to go through the motions of baking cookies. She was 2 years old, and she was mixing. I could see her. She was adding ingredients to her bowl, and then she was mixing. And there was an entire cultural practice unfolding in front of me, because clearly she had experienced that somewhere within her family culture. And so I talked with the educators, and they said she's baking cookies. And they told me, because I was a visitor in the room, they told me that, oh yeah, her mom, that's one of the things that her and her mom do together a lot, is they bake cookies. And I thought, wow, it's really great. She even cautioned me when I took one of her pretend cookies. They were little wood cookies that she was pretending to. And when I took one, she was like, oh, thank you for your care. Thank you for your care. Those things have been expressed to her, right? She's learning those things through her family culture. And that's what I mean when I say that culture comes from the children and the families. And observation is a sacred practice. Noticing what children are doing in their play and really being curious and wondering about, I wonder where that comes from. and going back to the family and having those conversations with the family, because the family, they know their children best. And you learn so much about the family culture when you bring the family voice into the playroom and into your stories.
Thanks for bringing up that point about taking things slow and how meaningful just observing child's play can be, and how those observations can help strengthen and build trust with families as well. When you're connecting those and you're talking with families about what you've observed, that's a way of building trust with families. We were wondering if you could share what has been a helpful approach that you've used to support your colleagues and team in slowing that down and making culture part of their practice. And maybe if you could share if there's any little signs and signals that you see that are on the right path, that this is now part of your everyday practice.
It's a great question. It's important as a leader that I am creating a responsive environment for my team, just as I would like to see them create for children and for families. And so one of the things is giving them that time, be protective of time outside of the playroom to be engaged in reflective practice with their colleagues and to be able to talk about the stories that families are sharing and to reflect on what those stories mean and what they're hearing. And then think about the types of projects that they want to collaborate with families on. I feel very privileged. Like the team here, they're already doing this work. I'm just making sure that they have the time to do it because they're very thoughtful in their relationship building alongside families. They are very thoughtful in asking families about their traditions, but also just the day-to-day rituals that are part of the family's culture and the family's practice. An example is one of the playrooms right now in the infant room, they have developed a documentation piece around the importance of sleep patterns for children. And they invited the family right into that. Tell us about your child's sleeping ritual. How does your child like to go to sleep? What comforts your child? When they invite the family in, that just creates that much more of a richer and authentic experience for children and for families, and helps to bridge the childcare and the home so that there is that sense of belonging, that sense of community that we hope that families truly experience when they're with us. I think the reflective practice time, like the planning time, I think that's a huge part of it. And really nurturing those observation practices in the team, when they come to planning, the kinds of questions that the facilitator is asking are things like, so tell me about what you're noticing of children and what are you noticing about families? How are families engaging with your learning stories? How are families engaging with the living wall? A really big part of what we are noticing is family engagement celebrations. So every month, the educators host a family engagement celebration within their playroom. Lots of times, the theme of the celebration will come from the families. The educators will ask them, what do you want to learn about, or what do you want to do? We've had things about, I want to know more about sensory play. So then they'll make sensory bottles together, and then they take the sensory bottle home. Other times, the educators in the toddler room did a poll. They had settled in on cars. They wanted to have all things cars. And so the educators set up this entire car family engagement event in the gym. They made a car wash, just ideas. I think that sometimes we can overlook some of the day-to-day ordinary moments that are still part of the culture we're creating alongside families and the playroom culture that also evolves, because it's a whole bunch of diverse folks in one room creating a culture of their own, and all of those different personalities and those unique ways of being and ways of knowing come together and create an entirely new culture, so to speak. And maybe that culture is around how much the children are enjoying playing with cars. Maybe it's about how much the children are enjoying caring for babies, because it's care practices are such a big part of home life. It's about who they are, what they know, and how they're showing up in the playroom. What are they doing in their play? You can really slow down and try to understand and make sure that there's materials in the space that support that.
Thank you for making that point. It kind of reminds me of we have a section in the Spark Guide that talks about how physical spaces can focus on three things, which is respecting, reflecting, and expressing. And then also, like you said, those opportunities for them to express their individual self and also their family and their culture. All of those three things are really important to build that sense of belonging and feeling included, bringing it back to that sense of community, being part of that bigger group and feeling that sense of belonging. So I really love how you brought that all together. On that note, we were wondering if you could share one piece of advice you would offer to someone new to culture responsiveness. Do you have any advice or key points that you could encourage people on?
I'm no expert. Like I said earlier, I'm a learner alongside others. And I think that is probably the best advice that I could probably relate to somebody is that just suspending those assumptions that we might have. There's so many stereotypical things out there in our world that we might not even realize are influencing how we interact with others. And so just taking the time to suspend our assumptions or biases and being a listener, taking the time to listen, understand others, to understand other points of view, other perspectives, and understand differences. It doesn't mean that we're always going to agree on everything because we're all so very different and very diverse, but celebrating those differences, finding ways to authentically celebrate those differences as well as our commonalities, and just carrying that sense of humility with you that we don't know everything. And how we learn is through that humility and that idea of coming alongside. I think sometimes we are always so quick to listen to respond instead of listening to understand. We learn about ourselves in those moments just as much as we learn about others.
I really love how you brought up the listening to learn and not always respond. I also relate as a talker myself. It is an ongoing learning process. I wondered if you could share any more things you found helpful and maybe people can continue that learning journey to incorporate culture in their everyday. What are things that you have found the most helpful?
Absolutely. So, one of the biggest resources that I find helpful is reaching out to community partners, different organizations, different people that have an experience that I don't have to help me understand. One of our biggest partners at Terra here is Bent Arrow. We really appreciate the knowledge and the expertise that Bent Arrow bring. We've had a lot of trainings with the facilitators through Bent Arrow to help us understand, to help us come alongside families who are Indigenous so that we can support them in a better way. We won't do it perfectly. We try to do it in a better way. And we can't do that on our own, you know?
Thank you again, Jody, for this conversation. I've loved how we've gone from routines and how we can incorporate things in everyday practices to engaging with families and all the way to physical spaces and how important documentation is and sharing that with families and then also putting it up on the walls to really make this feel like somewhere where families, communities, and children all have a sense of belonging. So we wanted to wrap up today and share something that stood out to each of us. For me, I really love how you started with inviting families as collaborators and really seeing families as experts in their kids, in themselves, in their cultures, and taking that learning and curiosity approach when you're meeting with families. Hale, what was your takeaway from today's conversation?
I think what resonated the most with me is how central stories are for you, and stories embedded in relationship so that there is trust. And then inviting families to make meaning of it. Because I think that is so important that we don't hear the stories and use our own interpretations of it, but that we actually listen to the families and their meaning and how they make sense of it. And then sharing it among the families and among the educators to build that community I really love that. And I think that's also something that's transferable to any context, relationship and stories, that those are these elements that will support that cultural learning and that sense of belonging.
I'm so glad that those points resonated for you, because if I had to say one thing that I hope listeners hear is that it's about relationships. We often talk around here that the relationships are the work, and that's the truth. That's how we learn about children through stories. We're all made of stories.
Thank you so much, Jody. I can't thank you enough for how amazing it's been to hear your stories and learn from your experiences. I think what you've shared will inspire a lot of people to continue learning and to build those relationships with families in a meaningful way. So thank you again for joining us today. Thanks for listening. Check out the show notes for any links or resources that were mentioned in today's episode. And if you want to learn more about culturally responsive childcare, go to sparkguide.ca to download the Spark Guide, access free trainings, and find more resources. See you in the next episode.